She walked into that courtroom with a newborn pressed against her chest, divorce papers in one hand, and what little dignity her husband hadn't already stolen in the other. Everyone was waiting for her to fall apart. Everyone expected tears, maybe even begging. But Madison Carter didn't give them that. She walked in calm, silent, composed in a way that should have made every person in that room deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Across the floor sat her billionaire husband, Ethan Carter, lounging beside his polished mistress like a man who had already counted his winnings. His mother, Alina, sat directly behind him, draped in designer fabric, dripping in jewelry, whispering into his ear like she had done his entire life. "Throw her out," she said. Just like that. A woman with a baby and an empty bank account has no power. Ethan didn't even hesitate. He laughed. Right there, in front of lawyers, executives, family, and the woman he'd replaced his wife with. He told Madison she was done. The house, gone. The cars, gone. And then, with a coldness that silenced even his own legal team, he suggested that their child would one day grow up understanding why he chose better. Then he waved his hand and had security escort his wife and newborn out of the room like they were strangers who had wandered in off the street. What Ethan didn't know, what none of them knew, was the thing that should terrify you most about underestimating a quiet woman. 3 nights before that courtroom, while his family was celebrating what they believed was his freedom, Madison had signed a single document. One document that made everything Ethan thought he owned, the company his family bled for, the empire his father built from nothing, the business his mother treated like a religion, disappear from under him, because it had been quietly, legally, completely purchased. And the new owner was the woman they had just humiliated in front of a judge. So Madison didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just looked at Ethan, then at his mother, then at the mistress sitting there wearing the diamonds from her old wedding set. And when she finally opened her mouth, the room didn't just go quiet. It stopped, because the woman they had thrown out with a newborn hadn't come to save her marriage. She had come to take their empire. The silence was the kind that physically presses down on a room. Madison could hear the soft, delicate breathing of her daughter against her chest. Little Arva shifted under her white blanket, tiny fingers curling around the edge of Madison's blouse, as though even a newborn could sense that the entire weight of something massive had just shifted in the air around them. Ethan stared at her. His smile hadn't left his face yet, but it had changed. It looked painted on now. Stiff. Embarrassing. Beside him, Vanessa Monroe, the woman he had proudly walked into this courthouse as his future, slowly lowered her phone. She had been recording. Of course, she had been recording. She'd probably planned to watch Madison's humiliation on a loop. But now the phone trembled in her perfectly manicured hand, the camera still running, capturing something she had never prepared for. Alina Carter sat rigidly upright, pearl necklace resting at her throat like a crown she believed no one could ever remove. She had spent 30 years making sure everyone understood that the Carter name was untouchable. She had trained servants to bow without being asked. She had trained executives to fear her before she even spoke. She had trained relatives to fall in line, and she had trained her own son to see women as either useful tools or inconvenient problems to be discarded. Madison had been useful when she stayed quiet. She became a problem the moment she stopped apologizing for breathing. "What did you just say?" Ethan asked. His voice had dropped to something dangerous. Madison shifted Arva gently, carefully, making sure not to fully wake her. That single small movement made Ethan angrier than any shouting could have, because it was too calm, too deliberate. It was the movement of a woman who already knew where every weapon in that room was, and had already taken the most important one off the table before anyone walked in. "I said," Madison replied, "I didn't come here to lose my marriage. I came to collect what belongs to me." Ethan laughed again, but nobody joined him this time, not even his own lawyer. Mr. Holloway, a narrow-faced man with silver-framed glasses and a long reputation for dismantling women in divorce courts, leaned toward his client with an expression he almost never wore. Concern. "Mr. Carter," he whispered, "perhaps we should request a brief recess." Ethan turned on him. A recess for what? Madison's attorney, Grace Whitmore, opened a black folder, and slid a clean stack of documents across the table without drama, without performance, without a single change in expression. Grace had been holding on to this moment for 48 hours. Ever since Madison had shown up at her office, newborn in arms, sealed envelope in hand, carrying a secret that made one of the wealthiest families in the state look dangerously exposed. "Your Honor," Grace said, "before Mr. Carter continues making declarations about property he no longer has legal authority over, we need to submit updated ownership documentation into the record." The judge, who had been watching this entire scene with growing irritation, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Updated ownership documentation." "Yes, Your Honor." Ethan leaned back and crossed his arms, trying to drag his arrogance back into the room. "This is a performance. Madison has nothing. She signed a prenuptial agreement. She walked away from everything." Madison looked at him then, really looked at him, and for one unguarded second, she saw the man underneath all of it, the one who existed before the Carter money had finished swallowing him whole. She remembered Ethan at 28, standing under the pale yellow glow of a gas station canopy in the middle of a storm, soaked to the skin because he had given her his jacket without being asked. He wasn't Carter Global Holdings then. He was just a man with exhausted eyes and dreams that still felt honest, telling her he wanted to build something his father never could. "I don't want to be like them," he had told her that night, rain running down his face. "My mother believes love makes you weak. My father believes loyalty is something you purchase. I want to be different. Madison, with you, I think I actually can be." She had believed every word. That was the first thing love disguises as wisdom. Years later, when Ethan's father died and the full weight of the Carter empire landed on his shoulders, Alina made certain the family's oldest poison didn't die with her husband. She moved through that mansion like smoke and silk, whispering at breakfast, correcting him in boardrooms, reminding him with practiced patience that emotion had nearly ruined his father before him. "Your wife is sweet," she would say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. But sweetness doesn't protect empires. In the beginning, Ethan pushed back. He held Madison's hand under dinner tables when Alina's comments cut a little too deep. He kissed her forehead before walking into meetings. He told her not to pay attention when Vanessa Monroe started appearing more frequently in the executive wing, laughing too easily at Ethan's remarks, touching his arm too naturally, praising his instincts in ways Madison recognized immediately as rehearsed. But the change came, slowly enough that Madison questioned her own perception. The hand under the table disappeared first. Then the forehead kisses became mechanical. Then the late nights became later with less explanation. And one evening, months before Arva was born, Madison stood in the corridor outside Ethan's private study and heard Alina say with quiet certainty, "Vanessa understands your world. Madison only understands your heart. One of those things builds power. The other one slowly takes it from you." Madison stood there and waited for him to object. He never did. That silence had been a prophecy, and she had spent every day since preparing for exactly this moment. In the courtroom, Grace tapped the first page of the document set. Carter Global Holdings has been operating under severe private debt restructuring for the past 18 months. Multiple key subsidiaries were pledged as collateral against outstanding instruments. 3 nights ago, those debt positions and their associated controlling shares were formally acquired, in full, by Whitestone Meridian Capital. Ethan's brow furrowed. What does any of that have to do with her? Grace turned to the next page without blinking. The judge leaned forward. Madison said nothing. Whitestone Meridian Capital, Grace continued, is a privately held acquisition firm. Its sole controlling owner, she paused just long enough for the room to feel it, is Madison Carter. Vanessa made a sound. Half laugh, half choke. Neither one finished. Ethan's face drained of everything. Alina was on her feet before her chair, stopped moving, the scrape of it cutting through the silence like a blade. That is an absolute lie. Grace didn't even look at her. Please sit down, Mrs. Carter. How dare you speak to me like... The judge's voice dropped like a hammer. Mrs. Carter, sit down or leave my courtroom. You will not get a third option. Alina sat, but her hands, Those perfectly composed, jewelry-laden hands were shaking. Ethan grabbed the documents directly from Holloway's grip before his lawyer could intervene. His eyes raced across the pages, hunting for a forgery, an error, a missing seal, any small crack in something that felt impossible. But the further he read, the quieter he became. The color left his face in stages, like a light being slowly turned down. Madison watched him read. She watched him discover, for the very first time, who she actually was. Not the wife he had stopped seeing. Not the woman he had replaced. Not the mother he had tried to humiliate in front of a room full of witnesses. The woman he had simply never bothered to look at closely enough. Before she ever became Madison Carter, she had been Madison Reed, a girl who grew up in a narrow brick row house at the edge of Baltimore, where the radiator groaned through every winter and her mother counted grocery money twice at the kitchen table before she ever walked through the store's front door. Her father, Thomas Reed, had worn the same rotation of budget suits to a job where he kept other people's financial secrets in perfect order, for companies that never once put his name on a single door, that he was quiet, careful, and brilliant in the particular way that poverty forces brilliance, not as a gift, but as a survival skill. He taught Madison numbers before he ever taught her bedtime stories. When people want to hide the truth, he would say, spreading old financial statements across their kitchen table like a map of someone else's war, they bury it in numbers. Learn to read them, and nobody can lie to you for long. Madison learned. By 16, she could locate missing money in a spreadsheet faster than her teachers could finish grading homework. By 21, she had scholarships, industry awards, and internship offers from firms that publicly admired her talent while privately wondering if she could fit the culture. By 28, she had quietly built the early foundation of Whitestone Meridian, but under a mentor's name, because the uncomfortable truth of that world was that investors listened more carefully when they believed the strategic genius behind the numbers was a gray-haired man in a Navy suit. That mentor was Charles Whitmore, Grace's father. Charles had been her father's oldest friend, a retired mergers and acquisitions predator who owed Thomas Reed a debt that no dollar amount could settle. When Madison's father got sick, Charles showed up at their small house every Thursday without being asked, carrying soup, yellow legal pads, and stories about boardrooms where powerful men had lost everything. Not through bad luck, but because they had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the quiet ones. Power, Charles told Madison once, while her father slept just on the other side of the thin wall, is not always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes power sits in the corner, takes careful notes, and buys the entire building while everyone else is still fighting over the furniture. Madison never forgot it. When her father died, he left her exactly 3 things: his watch, a letter, and a warning. The watch was old, scratched, and worth nothing to anyone but her. The letter said he was proud of her. Just that. Nothing more, as though he knew those 5 words were already everything. The warning was written in his careful handwriting on the back of a faded Carter Global invoice from 20 years earlier. Do not trust the Carter family with your heart or your money. At the time, Madison thought grief had made him dramatic. When she fell in love with Ethan years later, she nearly threw that warning away entirely. Nearly. Instead, she folded it once and placed it in a locked drawer, telling herself that the past was not always a map. But sometimes it was exactly that. In the courtroom, Ethan looked up from the documents slowly. The color in his face had not come back. You own Whitestone. Madison's expression didn't shift. Yes. You never told me. You never asked what I did with my time once you decided I was only your wife. Vanessa's voice came from beside him. Thin, almost fragile. That's impossible. I looked into her. Everyone knows she came from nothing. Madison turned and looked at her directly for the first time. You searched Madison Carter. You should have searched Madison Reed. The color that rose in Vanessa's face answered everything. Because it was true. She had searched. She had spent weeks combing through old social media posts, charity event photographs, wedding announcement pages, anything that might expose a scandal, a weakness, a reason to feel superior. What she found instead was a scholarship girl with a deceased father, a modest mother, and a deliberately quiet life. No inherited fortune. No powerful family connections. No society footprint worth envying. Vanessa had mistaken Madison's privacy for emptiness. Alina Carter had made the same mistake for years, only with far more cruelty and considerably more witnesses. She had called Madison simple in rooms she assumed Madison couldn't hear. Simple taste, simple background, simple mind. She once described her to a dinner guest as beautiful in a harmless way, and the table had laughed with the rehearsed politeness of people who knew which side their bread was buttered on, while Madison quietly refilled her water glass and memorized the face of every single person who smiled. Ethan had heard that, too. He had not said a word. The first real fracture didn't come quietly. It arrived at the Carter Foundation's annual gala, on a night when Madison was 4 months pregnant and wearing a blue gown Ethan had personally selected, because he said it made her look soft. Vanessa arrived in silver, escorted by no one, welcomed by everyone. Alina seated her at Ethan's right hand and placed Madison 3 seats down beside an elderly donor who asked her twice, with genuine confusion, whether she was part of the catering committee. When Madison found Ethan on the balcony later that evening, Vanessa's hand was resting against his chest. He stepped back when he saw her, but not quickly enough. Madison remembered the city lights behind him, bright, cold, indifferent. She remembered the way his face moved through guilt first, then settled into something worse, irritation. As though her pain was an interruption he hadn't scheduled. "It's not what you think," he said. "What do I think?" He had no answer for that. That night, Madison slept in the nursery she had just finished decorating. She sat on the floor beneath the hand-painted clouds on the ceiling, one hand resting on her stomach, and whispered something to her unborn daughter that she had never said out loud before. "I hope you never spend a single day of your life begging someone to choose you." The next morning, she called Charles Whitmore. "I need you to look into Carter Global's debt structure," she said. A long pause. "Madison, are you certain?" "No," she said. "That's exactly why I need facts." The facts arrived like a storm that had been gathering for years without anyone looking at the sky. Carter Global was not the fortress the world believed it to be. Ethan's father had expanded too aggressively, borrowed against assets that couldn't sustain the weight, and buried the losses inside subsidiaries with names so deliberately unremarkable that nobody wanted to read past the first line. Ethan had inherited a palace, gorgeous from the outside, eaten alive from within. Alina knew. The senior board members knew. The banks knew. But the public saw yachts, galas, and magazine covers, and assumed that anything which looked like gold couldn't possibly be rotting. Madison began watching. She watched Ethan take calls behind closed doors. She watched Alina schedule private lunches with bankers whose names never appeared in any press release. She watched Vanessa pour carefully manufactured confidence into Ethan's ear while simultaneously constructing her own escape routes. And she watched the company's debt, piece by piece, instrument by instrument, become available through channels Ethan had never once imagined she had access to. Every insult sharpened her focus. Every locked door taught her exactly where to find the key. Every time Ethan dismissed her reaction as emotional, she became more precise. And still, part of her prayed she would never have to use any of it. That part died 2 weeks before Arva was born. Ethan came home at midnight, and Madison knew before he was through the door. She was standing in the kitchen barefoot, drinking water because the baby had been restless for hours and sleep had stopped being something she was allowed to have. He stopped when he saw her. Irritation crossed his face before anything else did. "You're still awake." "So are you." He loosened his tie. "Don't." Madison looked at him, really looked, and saw what had replaced the man she married. Not the dreamer from the gas station. Not the boy in the rain, making promises he had almost kept. She saw Alina's son, polished, proud, hollow in every place where love used to live. "Are you in love with her?" He laughed, short, dismissive, the kind of laugh designed to make the other person feel foolish for asking. "You're pregnant and emotional. Answer me." His eyes went hard. "Vanessa doesn't make everything feel like a courtroom." The words were quiet. That made them worse than shouting. Madison set her glass down carefully on the counter. "And what do I make things feel like?" He held her gaze for just a moment too long before he said it. Small. The second it left his mouth, something shifted in his face, a flicker of recognition, as if some part of him understood that he had just stepped through a door that would not close behind him. But pride is a current that keeps moving even when it knows it's heading somewhere wrong. He let it carry him through. You make me feel small, Madison, like I'm always falling short of something. Vanessa believes in me. Madison nodded slowly, quietly. No, Ethan. Vanessa believes in what she thinks you still own. He stepped toward her. You know nothing about my world. And Madison almost smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because the universe has a precise and merciless sense of timing. Through the kitchen window behind him, lightning split the sky open. 3 days later, divorce papers arrived. 1 week after that, Arva came into the world. Ethan did not come to the hospital until the following morning. He arrived with Alina, who carried flowers the way someone carries an obligation, arms slightly extended, face professionally neutral. She wore white, as though attending the birth of her granddaughter was a business ceremony with a dress code. Vanessa waited downstairs in the car. Madison knew because one of the nurses mentioned, with barely concealed disbelief, that the woman in the black Bentley had now asked 3 times how much longer Mr. Carter would be. Ethan held Arva for less than 2 minutes. She's small, he said. She's perfect, Madison replied. Alina looked at the baby with the expression of someone completing an inspection. Well, she said, after a moment's consideration, at least she has the Carter eyes. Madison's mother, Diane, who had been sitting in the corner so quietly she'd almost disappeared into the wall, stood up slowly. Madison caught her wrist before she could speak. Diane Reed had spent her entire life absorbing disrespect with a grace she had never once been thanked for, swallowing indignity to preserve peace in rooms that had never deserved that peace. But that afternoon, standing 3 feet from Alina Carter while her newborn granddaughter slept in a hospital bassinet, even Diane nearly shattered. After Ethan left, Diane sat beside Madison's bed and cried without sound. Madison did not cry. She watched the door close behind her husband, heard the faint echo of his footsteps disappear down the corridor, and remembered, word for word, what her father had written on the back of that old invoice. Then she picked up her phone and sent Charles Whitmore exactly 4 words. Move forward. By the time Ethan's legal team had scheduled the courthouse proceedings, the acquisition was already sealed. Whitestone Meridian hadn't struck Carter Global from the front. That would have been noticed, contested, defended against. Instead, it moved through debt instruments, distressed asset purchases, emergency liquidity agreements, and strategic voting rights transfers. The financial equivalent of draining a building's foundation while the people inside argue about the curtains. Madison signed the final controlling documents at 2:17 in the morning. Arva slept in a bassinet 18 inches from her elbow. Grace Whitmore sat across from her, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled to the elbows, eyes carrying the particular kind of redness that comes from 2 consecutive nights without sleep. Charles was there too, older now, moving with a cane he refused to let slow him down, smiling with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching justice finally put on a well-tailored suit. Once you sign this, Grace said, and her voice carried a weight she didn't try to soften, there is no gentle version of what happens next. Madison looked at Arva sleeping. He already chose the hard version, she said, and she signed. Somewhere across the city, at that exact moment, Ethan Carter raised a champagne glass with Vanessa and Alina, fully convinced that Madison was finished, that she had nothing, that she was already gone. Now, in the courtroom, that belief died in front of an audience. Ethan came to his feet. This is fraud. Grace unfolded her hands slowly. No, Mr. Carter, this is business. My family would never have allowed. Your family lost the right to authorize anything the moment they defaulted on the obligations tied to their controlling assets. Alina's voice cracked with something between fury and fear. You planned this. Madison turned to her fully, for the first time all morning. No, Alina, you planned it. You told your son I had no power. You told him to throw me out. You said a woman with a baby and no money was no threat to anyone. She paused just long enough. I simply allowed you to say all of that loudly enough for the right people to hear exactly what kind of family you are. The words landed the way only the truth can. Not with a crash, but with the precise, irreversible sound of something breaking that can never be repaired. Ethan's eyes moved, involuntarily, instinctively, toward the back of the room. A row of men in expensive suits sat watching with the careful stillness of people calculating their next move. Several were Carter Global board members. They had come expecting to observe a routine divorce proceeding and show quiet support for a man they answered to. Madison had insisted, through legal channels, that corporate witnesses be present given the property implications of the case. Ethan had taken that as a desperate attempt to appear important. Now, not one of those men would meet his eyes. Martin Vale, the company's chief financial officer, looked physically ill. He had known for months that Carter Global was dangerously exposed. What he had not known, what none of them had known, was who had been watching from the other side of the wall. And he knew, with the clarity of a man watching the floor disappear beneath him, exactly what Madison now held in her hands: contracts, voting authority, emergency board powers, and the absolute legal ability to remove any executive who had helped conceal what the company had been hiding. Madison glanced at Martin Vale for exactly half a second. That was enough. He understood. His career began trembling before the rest of him caught up. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway, I strongly suggest you confer with your client," but Ethan was no longer in a place where legal advice could reach him. Pride had wrapped its hands around his throat and was squeezing. He pointed directly at Madison. Finger extended, jaw tight, the gesture of a man who had never once lost anything and did not know how to stand inside that feeling. "You think this makes you powerful? You think buying debt makes you one of us?" Madison tilted her head slightly. "One of you. You are not a Carter." Alina snapped, her voice shaking with something caught between fury and genuine terror. "You may have maneuvered your way through paperwork and legal signatures, but blood is blood. You will never be one of us." Madison smiled. It was small, calm, devastating in the way that only the truth can be devastating. "Thank God," she said. The room absorbed that in silence. Vanessa stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking open at the edges, panic bleeding through the polished surface she had spent years perfecting. "Ethan, say something. Tell them this can be reversed. Tell them." Ethan turned to his lawyer. His voice had dropped to something barely audible. "Can it?" Mr. Holloway removed his glasses slowly and set them on the table. That was answer enough. Madison shifted Arva gently against her chest and rose to her feet. When she spoke, her voice carried no anger, no triumph, no performance. Just clarity, the most dangerous thing in that room. "I have no interest in prolonging this. I will retain what is legally mine. You will keep your personal belongings. Carter Global will enter immediate restructuring. Alina will vacate her advisory office by Monday morning." She paused. "And Vanessa Monroe is banned from all Carter Global properties effective today." Vanessa's breath left her like she'd been struck. "You cannot do that." Madison's eyes dropped, just for a moment, to the diamonds resting at Vanessa's collarbone. Her old wedding diamonds. "I can do considerably more than that," Madison said. "Be grateful I'm starting there." Ethan's face contorted. "You don't get to humiliate me." Madison looked around the courtroom slowly, at the lawyers, the executives, the judge, the cameras waiting outside, and then back at the man she had once loved with everything she had. "Ethan," her voice was almost gentle, "I did not bring your lover to my divorce hearing. I did not allow my mother to insult the mother of my child. I did not order security to remove a newborn from a room she had every legal right to be in." A pause that felt like the moment before thunder. "You built this humiliation yourself, brick by brick. I only turned the lights on." For one unguarded second, just one, something human surfaced in Ethan's eyes. Something that might have been shame or the ghost of a memory. Madison wondered if he was back there too, at the gas station, in the rain, a soaked young man making promises he had almost kept. The man who said he would never become his parents. The flicker passed. His pride had outlived his love. "This isn't over," he said. Madison nodded once. "No, it is not." Outside the courthouse, cameras were already in position. Ethan had arranged them himself. He had wanted the world to witness him walking out victorious. Vanessa at his side, Madison somewhere behind him, diminished and erased. Alina had approved the strategy. Vanessa had chosen her outfit specifically for it. They had planned a performance. They got one, just not the one they rehearsed. The courthouse doors swung open, and Madison stepped out first. Sunlight landed on her face. Arva slept peacefully against her chest, undisturbed by the world rearranging itself around her. Grace walked at Madison's side, the black folder tucked beneath her arm, the folder that had just quietly detonated an empire from the inside. Behind them came Ethan, pale, furious, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with how he was dressed. Vanessa followed with mascara beginning to gather at the corners of her eyes. Alina gripped her handbag so tightly her knuckles had gone the color of paper. Reporters surged forward like a wave hitting a wall. "Mrs. Carter, is it confirmed you acquired Carter Global?" "Mr. Carter, did you know your wife controlled Whitestone Meridian?" "Mrs. Carter, what becomes of the family business now?" Ethan moved to step in front of her. Instinct, reflex, the muscle memory of a man accustomed to occupying the center of every room. But security shifted to block him. Not courthouse security. Not Carter family security. Whitestone Meridian's private protection team formed a quiet, professional line around Madison and Arva, as naturally as if they had been doing it for years. Another prophecy fulfilled. Months earlier, still living inside the Carter mansion, Madison had passed the security office late one night and heard laughter through the half-open door. One guard had been talking to another. "Mrs. Carter," he'd said, in a tone that made the title sound like a punchline. "She doesn't need protection. She needs permission." The guard no longer worked there. Madison stopped at the top of the courthouse steps. Microphones rose toward her from every direction, a forest of them, tilted upward like something waiting to bloom. She hadn't planned to speak. She had planned to walk to the car, let the lawyers handle the press, and go home to her daughter and her mother and the quiet work that still lay ahead. But then Arva made a small sound against her chest, barely a breath, a murmur in sleep, and Madison thought about all the rooms her daughter would walk into someday. Rooms where someone might measure her worth by how gently she spoke. Rooms where someone might mistake her patience for passivity, her kindness for weakness, her silence for submission. Madison looked straight into the cameras. "Carter Global will continue operating," she said. "Employees will be protected. Mismanagement will not. The company is entering a new era of accountability, and every person who used institutional power to harm others will answer for it, fully and on the record." A reporter pushed forward. "And your marriage, Mrs. Carter?" Her gaze moved to Ethan for just a moment. Brief, unbothered. "My marriage ended the day my husband confused loyalty with weakness." Ethan flinched. It was small, barely visible, but every camera caught it. Alina could not stop herself. She never could. She stepped forward, voice sharp with the authority of a woman who had never once in 30 years been denied the last word. "This is a private family matter." Madison turned to face her one final time. "It stopped being private when you instructed your son to have my newborn removed from courtroom." The cameras swung toward Alina Carter like a single organism responding to prey. For the first time in her life, Alina stood in a room, or rather, on a stage under open sky, with no walls powerful enough to hide inside. No dinner table to control. No boardroom to command. No carefully managed guest list to protect her from consequence. The clip went everywhere before the sun had finished moving. By evening, financial networks were dissecting the acquisition on live television. By midnight, Carter Global's board had issued an emergency meeting request. By the following morning, Ethan's phone had become a device he could no longer look at, filled with messages from investors, business partners, old friends performing concern, and enemies performing friendship, all of them circling what they already sensed was a carcass. Vanessa stayed at his penthouse that night, but she did not touch him. She moved in tight, anxious circles near the floor-to-ceiling windows, still wearing Madison's diamonds at her throat, scrolling frantically through financial forums and legal databases and gossip columns, hunting for a loophole, a rumor, any thread she could pull that might unravel what had happened. "This doesn't make sense," she kept saying, to no one in particular. "Women like her don't just own companies like that. It doesn't happen like this." Ethan sat in the dark across the room, a glass in his hand that he hadn't once brought to his lips. Women like her. That phrase moved through him like something with teeth, because the shameful truth was that he had believed it too. He had believed it for years. He remembered Madison in their first apartment, long before the mansion, before the empire, before everything, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 3 monitors open and spreadsheets running across all of them. He used to stand in the doorway and joke that she looked like someone planning a quiet takeover. She would smile without looking up and say, "Not a country." He had thought she was being playful. He remembered her at dinner with his father, asking questions that made the table go slightly still. Sharp, precise questions about acquisition debt and voting structures and the kind of financial architecture that most people at that table didn't understand well enough to ask about. His father had stared at her for 3 seconds too long before saying, with genuine surprise he couldn't quite disguise, "You understand finance." Madison had replied simply, "Enough." Afterward, Ethan had teased her for unsettling his father. She had looked at him calmly and said, "Powerful men only get uncomfortable when they realize someone in the room can read the fine print." He had kissed her then. He had been proud of her then, when exactly had that pride curdled into resentment. Ethan didn't know, or perhaps he did, and knowing it clearly would require a kind of honesty he had been carefully avoiding for the better part of a decade. At 3 in the morning, Vanessa sat down across from him and finally said what fear had been constructing inside her all night, brick by careful brick. "What happens to me?" Ethan looked up slowly. "My brand partnerships, my board invitations, the charity position, the apartment you promised." Her voice was steady in the practiced way of someone who has learned to perform calm while panicking. "If she controls the company now, what does that mean for me?" Something moved through Ethan's chest. Cold, clarifying, ugly in the way that only the truth can be ugly when you've been hiding from it. Madison had been right. Vanessa hadn't asked what this meant for him. She hadn't asked if he was all right. She hadn't asked what came next for them together. She had asked, with perfect instinctive precision, what it meant for herself. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Monday morning, Madison walked into Carter Global Headquarters, and the building knew it before anyone said a word. Not as Ethan's wife, not as Alina's quiet disappointment, not as the woman certain members of staff had once pitted as Vanessa swept through the lobby beside Ethan like she was already measuring for new furniture. She walked in as chairwoman, and the lobby responded the way all spaces respond to power when it finally arrives in its rightful form. Receptionists stood straighter without being told. Executives gathered near elevators with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had spent years laughing at the wrong woman and were now rapidly recalculating every interaction they could remember. The private executive gate, the one that had once required Ethan's presence for Madison to pass through without mild embarrassment, opened before she reached it. The same marble floors that had once carried her silently in her husband's wake now reflected only her steps. Arva was not with her. Madison had left her home with Diane, who had kissed the baby's forehead and then her daughter's cheek and whispered, "Your father would have loved every second of this." Madison had smiled. He warned me about this part. At the top floor, the boardroom waited with the particular tension of a room that has been dreading a meeting it cannot cancel. Alina was already inside. She had taken her seat at the far end of the table, the chair she had occupied for years, the position she had held through a husband, a son, and a dynasty, as though the right to sit there were written in her blood rather than in any document that could be legally superseded. Ethan stood near the window with his arms crossed, staring at the city below as if trying to remember when it had belonged to him. Vanessa was absent. The building access ban had been clean and immediate. Martin Vale sat rigid between 2 legal advisors, perspiration visible at his collar despite the air conditioning. Madison entered with Grace, Charles, and a restructuring team whose combined expertise had cost her considerable resources and been worth every cent. No one spoke. She walked to the head of the table and sat down. Alina's eyes burned across the room. That seat belonged to my husband. Madison opened her folder without looking up. And then to your son. She smoothed the first page. And now to me. That is how ownership works, Alina. It follows the paperwork. Ethan's voice came from the window, low and tight. You're enjoying this. Madison looked at him then, and her voice, when it came, carried something more cutting than anger. It carried grief without apology. No, I enjoyed loving you, Ethan. I enjoyed believing the things you told me in the rain. I enjoyed painting clouds on a nursery ceiling and hoping that by the time our daughter could look up at them, her father might have found his way back to the man he promised he was. She paused. This part one did not enjoy. This part one earned. The board members looked at the table. No one argued. Madison opened the meeting the way her father had taught her to open every hard conversation. Not with emotion, not with performance, but with numbers. She walked them through the hidden debt, methodically, mercilessly, line by line. The wasteful departmental spending disguised as operational costs. The executive bonuses distributed while junior staff were being quietly eliminated. The luxury retreats filed as strategic planning sessions. The contracts awarded not on merit, but on the basis of Alina's personal relationships. The consulting payments, and here she paused, just briefly, routed directly to Vanessa Monroe's lifestyle company. For services that, upon thorough review, no one in this building could demonstrate had ever actually been performed. Vanessa's name on the projection screen drained the remaining color from Ethan's face. Madison had not known about that in the beginning. She found it 2 days after giving birth. Sitting in bed with Arva sleeping beside her, warm, small, impossibly perfect, Madison opened a subsidiary filing she hadn't been able to reach before the delivery. A shell company. A monthly retainer. A signature she recognized. Ethan's. Authorizing payment. To Vanessa's company. For services no one could name, in amounts no one had been asked to justify. Not just betrayal. Finance betrayal. Signed, approved, and buried in paperwork he had assumed she would never be well enough, or brave enough, or free enough to find. In the boardroom, Alina raised her hand to interrupt. Those arrangements were standard practice for executive consulting relationships. Madison clicked to the next slide without looking up. No, she said. They were theft, dressed up in arrogance, and filed under a name nobody bothered to question. Martinvale leaned forward, voice low. Madison, Chairwoman Carter. Grace's correction landed like a gavel. Martin swallowed. Chairwoman Carter. I was operating under direct instruction. I want the board to understand that I had no independent. Madison looked at him. So was everyone who ever chose wrong, she said, and then wanted pity for it afterward. Martin said nothing else. By the time the meeting ended, 3 executives had tendered resignations. 2 were placed under formal investigation. Alina's advisory position was dissolved. Ethan was removed from operational control, pending a full review. The board voted with the unanimity of people who had run out of room to argue, buried under documentation they could not dispute, and consequences they had spent years assuming would never arrive. Alina did not shout when it was over. Shouting would have given Madison the satisfaction of a visible defeat. Instead, she waited until the room had mostly cleared and then approached the head of the table slowly, deliberately, the way a woman moves when she has decided to make one final impression. You think this makes you safe? She asked. Madison closed her folder and looked up. No, it makes me prepared. You have no idea what families like mine survive. Madison stepped closer, and when she spoke, she dropped her voice low enough that only Alina could hear it. Low enough that it felt less like a threat and more like a fact being delivered to someone who had run out of time to avoid it. And you have no idea what women like me remember. For the first time in Madison's presence, possibly for the first time in years, Alina Carter looked afraid. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. A small, precise fracture behind the eyes of a woman who had built her entire identity on never being the one who blinked first. She blinked. Weeks passed. The Carter name continued its public unraveling, while the company itself, quietly, stubbornly, began to breathe again. Madison kept the employees, all of them she could justify keeping. She froze executive luxuries immediately. She sold 3 private jets without ceremony and redirected the proceeds into operational stabilization. She scheduled meetings with department heads Ethan had stopped speaking to years ago. She walked factory floors. She visited regional offices in cities the previous leadership had treated as afterthoughts. She listened far more than she spoke, and she remembered what people told her, and she came back with answers. Stories began to spread through the company the way warmth spreads through a building after a long winter, slowly, skeptically at first, and then all at once. The chairwoman remembered your name. The chairwoman answered the email. The chairwoman walked the floor without an entourage. The chairwoman reversed the severance cuts. The chairwoman removed the manager nobody had been allowed to report. She did not humiliate everyone who had underestimated her, only the ones who had caused harm while doing it. That distinction, that precision, made her more frightening than any broad act of revenge could have. From a distance, Ethan watched the company's stock stabilize and then rise. He watched journalists who had called Madison the abandoned wife begin calling her the architect of the Carter rescue. He watched former investors return with apologies disguised as enthusiasm. He watched business magazines request interviews she gave thoughtfully and on her own terms. He should have felt relief. The company he had inherited from his father and nearly destroyed was surviving. Instead, he felt replaced. One evening he arrived at her new home without calling ahead. It was not a mansion, not by Carter standards. It was large and elegant and private, with warm light falling from the windows and a garden just beginning to bloom at its edges. The kind of home Madison would choose for herself, beautiful without needing anyone to acknowledge it. Diane answered the door. She had Arva against her shoulder, and when she saw Ethan standing on the porch, her face closed like a door being locked from the inside. "No," she said simply. Ethan looked past her at his daughter. Arva was awake, staring at him with wide, grave eyes, the Carter eyes, as Alina had once announced like a claim of ownership. But looking at her now, Ethan saw Madison too. The calm, the quiet watchfulness, the sense of a person who was already, at less than a year old, storing everything she observed. "I need to speak to Madison," he said. Diane's expression made clear she had specific thoughts about that request that she was choosing, with great personal effort, not to express. But Madison appeared behind her. "It's okay, Mom." Diane looked at Ethan one more time, a look that said, "I have not forgiven you in this life or prepared to in the next one," then carried Arva back inside without another word. Madison stepped onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind her. Ethan had rehearsed in the car. He had constructed entire paragraphs, apologies that were really explanations, explanations that were really accusations, accusations dressed carefully in the language of remorse. But standing in front of her, in the soft dark of an evening that smelled unmistakably like rain, every sentence collapsed under its own weight. "You should have told me," he said finally. Madison looked at him without expression. "That is what you came to say. I was your husband. You were my husband when you brought your mistress to our divorce proceedings." He looked away. The night air shifted, and for one aching, involuntary second, he was back at the gas station. A younger Madison laughing as lightning split the sky. A younger Ethan making promises he had believed completely at the time. "I lost myself," he said. Something in Madison's eyes softened, just slightly. Not enough to be mistaken for forgiveness. More like recognition. The particular grief of someone who already knows the ending. "No, Ethan, you chose yourself. There is a difference. I want to see Arva." "You will, through the custody schedule our attorneys arrange." His jaw tightened. "You don't trust me. I trust patterns." "That isn't fair." Madison looked at him with the quiet, unshakable disbelief of someone being asked to define a word in a language the other person has never learned. "Fair." She said it the way you say a word that has lost all meaning through misuse. "Ethan, I gave birth while your lover waited in a car outside the hospital, counting the minutes. I carried your newborn daughter into a courtroom where your mother announced we were powerless. You watched security reach for me while I was holding her." She paused. "Do not come to my door asking about fare, because consequences have finally learned your address." He absorbed it without moving. He had no defense worth raising. "I loved you," he whispered. And something crossed Madison's face then. Not weakness, not longing, not the opening of a door he was hoping to walk back through. Grief, clean and honest, for a version of them that had died slowly, over years, without a single funeral to mark its passing. "I know," she said. "That's what made it hurt." He looked at her, desperate in a way that pride had not yet finished smothering. "And now I love my daughter more than I miss her father." The door opened behind her. Arva's voice came from inside. Small, insistent, unmistakable. Madison turned immediately, instinctively, completely. That turn answered every question Ethan had left. He was no longer the center of her life. He was barely a presence at its edges, like a light someone had already walked away from, still faintly visible in the distance. A month later, Vanessa tried to sell a story. She approached a tabloid with a version of events that painted Madison as a calculating predator, a woman who had manipulated a vulnerable husband, manufactured motherhood as a sympathy strategy, and stolen a family's legacy through legal sleight of hand. The tabloid was interested. The story was prepared. Then Grace Whitmore delivered package. Contracts, payment trails, text records, evidence of Vanessa's consulting payments drawn directly from Carter Global accounts. Payments authorized for services that, upon examination, existed only as invoices. The story did not run. 2 days later, a different story appeared. Vanessa Monroe under investigation for fraudulent corporate payments. Vanessa called Ethan 17 times that day. He answered once. "You said you would protect me," she said. She was crying, or performing crying, and by that point, even she may not have known the difference. Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, surrounded by furniture Vanessa had selected with his credit cards and silence that Madison would have filled, without trying, with warmth. "I can't even protect myself," he said. She cursed him. She hung up. He did not call back. Alina lasted longer. She always lasted longer than anyone expected. That was perhaps the truest Carter trait she possessed. She refused to leave the Carter mansion even after the legal transfer of company-held properties was finalized. She hosted lunches. She wore her diamonds to events where fewer people were coming. She told anyone who would listen that Madison's control was temporary, an aberration, a legal accident that would eventually correct itself. But invitations arrived less frequently. Calls were returned more slowly. Women who had once navigated rooms carefully to avoid offending her now spoke about her with something that had curdled from fear into pity. And pity, Alina had always understood, was the most humiliating of the two. The final reckoning came at the Carter Foundation's annual gala. Madison attended as chairwoman and primary donor. She wore an emerald gown, modest, precise, the choice of a woman who had nothing left to prove to her room. She spoke about ethical leadership and employee dignity and what it means to rebuild an institution that has long confused the accumulation of wealth with the possession of worth. Alina sat in the audience, not at the head table, where she had presided for 30 years. 3 rows back, between people who did not know her well enough to be intimidated by her. Ethan stood at the edge of the room and watched. When Madison finished speaking, the applause came immediately and stayed long. Alina did not clap. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, jaw tight, eyes forward, until the woman beside her raised her hands. Then the man behind her. Then everyone within her orbit, one by one, drawn into the current of it, until the silence around Alina Carter became conspicuous enough to be its own statement. Slowly, with cameras nearby and 30 years of pride burning like acid at the back of her throat, Alina lifted her hands and clapped. Madison saw it. Every person in that room who mattered saw it. Madison gave no sign of triumph. No nod, no smile, no acknowledgement whatsoever, which was, of course, the most devastating response available. After the gala, Ethan found his mother standing alone in a side hallway lined with oil portraits of Carter men. Founders, chairmen, builders, looking down from gilded frames as though history were a room they personally owned. Alina was staring at the empty wall space at the far end. The space where Ethan's portrait had once been commissioned and then quietly shelved. "They'll put her there," Alina said. Ethan followed her gaze. He had expected the thought to ignite something in him. Indignation, resistance, the reflex of a man defending his name. Instead, it just made him tired. Tired in the particular way of someone who has spent years fighting a current and has finally stopped swimming. "She saved the company," he said. Alina turned on him. "She stole it." "No." His voice was quiet and certain in a way it hadn't been in years. "We lost it before she ever arrived. She just caught it before it hit the ground." Alina's face did something he hadn't seen it do in a very long time. "You sound like her. Maybe that means I'm finally telling the truth." She slapped him. It wasn't hard enough to leave a mark, but it rang through the empty hallway like the last echo of something that had been breaking for years and had only just now finished. Ethan touched his cheek slowly and looked at his mother, and saw, perhaps for the first time without the film of childhood over his eyes, the woman behind the pearls and the dynasty and the curated imperviousness. Not powerful, terrified. Terrified of being ordinary. Terrified that without the Carter name, the Carter money, and the obedience of everyone around her, she was simply a woman who had spent her entire life teaching her son how to destroy his own happiness, and had succeeded completely. "I became everything you wanted me to be," Ethan said. He didn't say it with anger. That was almost worse. "And it cost me everything." Alina's lips pressed together, trembled once, held. Carter pride had trained her too thoroughly for apologies. Even now, winter turned to spring. Madison's life did not become painless. She had never expected painless. But it became honest, and she had learned, in the hardest possible way, that honest was worth more. Arva grew round-cheeked and bright-eyed and laughed with her whole body at things adults had forgotten were funny. Diane moved closer and filled the house with the particular kind of warmth that only a mother who has watched her child survive something can bring. Grace became more than an attorney. She became the kind of friend you make after difficulty, forged in something real. Charles visited on Sundays, older and slower, and held Arva with the careful terror of a man who had navigated billion-dollar negotiations but lived in genuine fear of dropping a baby. Sometimes, late at night, after Arva was asleep and the house was quiet, Madison remembered Ethan as he had been. Memory was cruel that way. It did not erase the good just because the bad had won. She remembered dancing with him in their first apartment, both of them laughing because they couldn't afford furniture yet, but somehow felt like the richest people alive. She remembered him reading business books aloud in bed, mispronouncing French company names until she corrected him, and he tried again with exaggerated formality that made her hide her face in the pillow. She remembered the gas station. She remembered the rain. But then Arva would stir, or the baby monitor would crackle with a small sound, and Madison would return to the present. The past was a room she could visit. It was not a house she had to live in. On Arva's first birthday, Madison hosted a small gathering in the garden. No cameras, no executives, no society guests performing attendance. Just family, close friends, afternoon sunlight, garden flowers, and a pink cake that Arva immediately attacked with both hands and no apology. Ethan came for 1 hour. He arrived without Alina, without Vanessa, without arrogance, which was the heaviest thing he had carried for years and the most exhausting to finally set down. He brought one gift, a small music box shaped like a carousel, its painted horses mid-gallop, its mechanism playing something gentle and old. Madison recognized at the instant she saw it. Years ago, before everything had gone wrong, they had walked past an antique shop on a Saturday afternoon and stopped at the window. There had been a music box exactly like this one. Madison had said, almost to herself, "One day, if we have a daughter, I'd love to give her something like that." Ethan had remembered. That hurt more than forgetting would have. Forgetting would have been easier to file away. Arva reached for him when he got close. Curious, cautious, assessing in the way of a child who has not yet learned to hide what she notices. Madison allowed him to take her. He held his daughter with a carefulness that had no performance in it, no audience management, no name to protect. Just a man finally understanding that a child was not an extension of his legacy, but a life he would have to earn slowly through choices made when no one was watching. She judges people the same way you do, Ethan said quietly, watching Arva study him with solemn concentration. Madison almost smiled. Then she'll be fine. He looked up. You're fine. No, Madison said, watching her daughter tug at his collar with small, certain hands. I'm healing. That's better than pretending. Ethan nodded, for once, without argument. Before he left, he stopped at the garden gate and turned back. Madison. She looked at him. I'm sorry. Simple. Clean. No clause attached. No request tucked inside it. No invoice for forgiveness hidden underneath. Madison studied him for a long moment. The garden was bright around them. Arva babbled something from inside. Somewhere nearby, Diane was laughing at whatever Charles had just said. I hope, Madison said finally, that you become someone Arva can be proud of. Not forgiveness. Not punishment. A door left unlocked, but not swung open. The most honest kind of mercy offered to someone who had run out of room to ask for more. Ethan accepted it like the gift it was. Years later, people would still tell the story of the day Madison Carter walked into a courthouse carrying a newborn and walked out carrying an empire. They would exaggerate certain parts. They would soften others. They would sand her down into a legend shaped by whoever was telling it that day. Some would say she had planned revenge from the very beginning. Some would say she never truly loved Ethan at all. Some would call her cold. Some would call her calculated. Some would tell the story like a fairy tale and miss the point entirely. They would all be wrong. Madison had loved deeply, completely, and without reservation. That was not a weakness in the story. That was the engine of it. Because it was love, real, unguarded love, that made the betrayal land hard enough to wake her up instead of breaking her down. She had not wanted an empire. She had wanted a family. She had wanted clouds painted on a nursery ceiling and a husband who kept his word and a life built on something more durable than performance. But when the family she had married into moved to strip her of dignity, security, motherhood, and peace, when they looked at a woman holding a newborn and saw only something disposable, they made the last mistake available to people who have stopped paying attention. They forgot to look at what she was actually holding. And what she was holding was not powerlessness. It was everything her father had given her: numbers, patience, memory, and the unshakable understanding that the truth does not disappear just because powerful people have buried it somewhere inconvenient. Madison kept her father's old watch on her desk at Carter Global. Scratched. Plain. Worth nothing to anyone who didn't know the story behind it. It sat beside a framed photograph of Arva laughing in the garden, mouth wide open, eyes squeezed shut, pink cake on both hands, and visitors sometimes glanced at the watch with polite confusion. Why would a billionaire chairwoman keep something so worn, so unremarkable, in a place of such deliberate prominence? Madison never explained. She didn't need to. Every tick reminded her that time reveals what pride spends years attempting to bury. Every tick reminded her that silence is not the same thing as surrender. And every tick reminded her of the morning Ethan Carter stood in a courtroom and laughed, genuinely laughed, believing he had discarded a powerless woman with nothing left to lose, not knowing he had just handed his entire kingdom to its rightful queen.